Good evening. Welcome, everybody. My name is Nalini Anand. I'm the Managing Director of the Global Health Institute here at Georgetown, and we're delighted to welcome you here for this really special event this evening. This is going to be a very timely conversation, as you can see, on shaping the future of global health in the Americas. We are especially grateful to the Americas Institute, to the School of Foreign Service, Science, Technology, and International Affairs program, and the O'Neill Center for Health and Human Rights for co-sponsoring this event. They've been amazing partners for us, and we look forward to collaborating more in the future. Just a few words to help set the stage, and I know Denise is going to do something similar, but across the Americas, we are really at a very pivotal moment for global health. The region has demonstrated, and I'm sure you'll agree, Dr. Barbosa, remarkable resilience and innovation in recent years. I think of it as a living laboratory, from expanding primary health systems and advancing universal health coverage, to multi-sector interventions to prevent childhood obesity, to harnessing mobile and other low-cost technologies to diagnose and treat disease, and also strengthening regional cooperation through institutions like the Pan American Health Organization. But we all know significant challenges remain in the region. The COVID-19 pandemic exacted an enormous toll on Latin America, where a combination of social disparities and vulnerabilities led to unprecedented health and economic crises, the impact of which is still reverberating in countries in the region. And many are now navigating constrained fiscal space while responding to overlapping and really intersecting pressures, some of which include the dual burden of chronic non-communicable disease and infectious disease, rising mental health disorders, aging populations, and of course, the growing impact of climate change. So these simultaneous challenges not only demand technical solutions, which they do, but really new partners, new models of partnership, trust building, and cross-sector collaboration. So to that end, I now have the honor of introducing Dr. Jarbas Barbosa, Director of the Pan American Health Organization, who will share his perspectives on these current challenges, but really I'm eager to hear about his vision for how we can move forward together to advance health in the region. Dr. Barbosa, welcome to Georgetown. And joining Dr. Barbosa is our moderator for this evening, Denise Yanovich. She is the Managing Director of Georgetown's Americas Institute. So with that, I turn it over to you, Denise, to begin the conversation. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us.
So thank you, everyone, for joining us on this beautiful spring afternoon. I know it's a challenging time at Georgetown as study days, exams, so it's incredible. It shows the level of convening power that you have, that we have this wonderful group of people here with us today. I want to thank Nandini for inviting me and Johanna to moderate this conversation. And it's a privilege to have you here, Dr. Barbosa, at Georgetown. As I was preparing for this event, collaborating on health issues across the Americas should be so self-evident. Transmissible diseases don't care about national borders. And then usually we are aware of collaboration on health when things don't work, like during the pandemic. But there's so much going on, and I hope we can talk about how collaboration is taking place in the region. And there's so much that countries can learn from each other, from dealing with pandemics, as well as effective ways to establish preventive care, chronic disease management, and expanding successful examples of community-based would benefit everyone. The need to collaborate is so evident that it predates the existence of most of the multilateral systems. That when we think of multilateralism, we think of the UN, or at least I do. PAHO predates the United Nations. And Latin America represents one of the most diverse and unequal regions in the world. And this duality defines its health landscape. Over the past 2 decades, however, countries have made significant gains in the life expectancy, maternal and child health, and infectious disease control. But these gains remain fragile and uneven. In addition to that, multilateralism is under threat as well as scientific knowledge is being questioned. Health systems and outcomes are being strained by climate change, non-communicable diseases, demographic changes, and the unequal access to care. The weakening of collaboration between countries endangers what has been achieved under the umbrella of PAHO. Just to name a few of the achievements, things that seemed self-evident 10 years ago, but now are being questioned, is the eradication of smallpox, polio, measles, and a significant reduction of malaria. Harmonization of regulatory issues, that has been a huge achievement of PAHO. Health surveillance, information sharing, promoting primary health care, standardized health data, things that are really facilitate collaboration in the health sector. However, during COVID-19, it laid bare fundamental flaws in political leadership, coordination, and health policy integration. And it is in this context that we will have the opportunity to hear from you, Dr. Barbosa, on the way forward for the region. We will have a conversation. I'll ask you for questions, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. I think that's the most interesting part of these events. So I was hoping to start, Dr. Barbosa, for you. If you could give us the context of what I just described, what do you see as the main opportunities and challenges for PAHO's operations in the Americas? And in this time of change in the landscape of global health, where do you see opportunities emerging? What gives you hope?
Thank you. Good afternoon. First, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I really appreciate this kind of dialogue with the public health and global health community that are around the town here. Let me start it. Maybe everybody Google PAHO and knows about PAHO, but just for the ones that didn't have time to do that, PAHO was founded in 1902 as part of the Pan-Americanist movement that had created 2 years before the Organization of the American States. So when we are the oldest health international organization in the world, when the World Health Organization was created in 1948, all the regional international organizations merged into WTO except PAHO. And our member states made the decision to keep PAHO as an independent organization that integrates the Inter-American system with our own constitution, our own membership. But at the same time, in 1949, PAHO and WTO signed an agreement, and PAHO also serves as WTO regional office for the Americas. So we are a double organization. Going to the question, think that you know that the Americas is probably one of the most diverse regions in the world. We have at the same time in our membership, the richest country in the world, that's the United States, and we have countries like Haiti that are facing difficulties to provide basic services to their citizens. But even we go into the countries, we can find a lot of inequities and within the countries. So Latin America and the Caribbean, sometimes the global mechanism, they think that the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, they don't need to receive the international support because they are middle-income countries. Behind or below the average, we have very important pockets of poverty, of lack of access to basic services, mainly among some populations that live in specific vulnerable situations, like indigenous populations, like in rural area, people that live in rural area, Afro-descendants, people that live in the big slums in the cities in Latin America that sometimes are totally cannot go outside the moment that they want to go because the violence, and other challenges. So it's we have this context. At the same time, we have a very rapid demographic transition in Latin America and the Caribbean. Now we are doing 20 years what Europe had almost 1 century. So people sometimes they say as a joke, but it's also true that Europe first went rich before getting old. In the Americas, we are getting old without being rich. So we needed to think about how to prepare the health system, but also the whole society to deal with this rapid demographic transition. We have an epidemiological scenario that is very complex. We were the epicenter of the last flu pandemic, the 2009 H1N1 pandemic flu. During the COVID-19, we had some variants emerging in the region that also made our region epicenter for the transmission during a certain period of time. So we definitely need to deal with the permanent threat of new virus emerging, or virus that we know that can evolve and to become a public health emergency. So we need to strengthen the country's capacity to prevent and to be more prepared for early detection and rapid response when they have a public health emergency. And we are not talking about the future pandemic. We are talking about the problems that we have nowadays. Yellow fever cases happening in the non-traditional area in Colombia, in Peru, chikungunya virus that now expanded from the Amazon region, measles outbreaks in Canada, the US, Mexico, Bolivia, and Guatemala. So we are talking about the several public health problems that we need to respond now. At the same time, we have communicable diseases that still persist. Now, of course, that the Americas, I'm very proud to say that we are a leader in global health. When you see the achievements that you have had in this region, I think that we really need to be very proud. But at the same time, we are not comfortable to see that some diseases that could be already eliminated as a public health problem, because we have the tools, we have the strategies, are still moving in a pace that's not the pace that you'd like to see them. At the same time, you have non-communicable diseases that now are responsible for 80% of the mortality. But the real problem is not this 80%. The real problem is that around 34 to 38% of these deaths could be prevented if we had a primary health care more prepared to make early diagnosis, to offer access to medicines, to control diabetes, hypertension, to promote early detection for cancer and other activities. At the same time, you have a region that is particularly vulnerable to climate change events, like the Caribbean. And for instance, that almost every year we have hurricane sessions that are a huge threat for the society, but also for the health services. We also have some characteristics in the region that we are not proud of. We have in Latin America one of the highest rates of pregnancy among adolescents in the world. So it's a very complex epidemiological scenario that we really need to address. So to conclude, I think that these are the scenarios that we work on. And the most important thing is that the fact that we have in the region a Pan-American Health Organization, I think that is an advantage. Several other regions in the world now, they think that they need to build more stronger regional institutions, like the African head of states made when they decided to create the CDC Africa, right? Because of course that the World Health Organization plays a very important role to bring global governance, but the direct contact with the countries, the provision of technical cooperation direct to the countries, in my view, is much better performed by regional organizations. I think that this is an advantage. PAHO, as you know, we are present in all the 51 countries and territories of the Americas, from Canada to Argentina. We also have the 3 countries that are participant members, the UK, the Netherlands, and France, because they have provinces, territories in departments, like they say in France, in the region. And so we have a very strong country presence, and we work together with these countries to advance the public health agenda. We are not implementers. The only country that we are a bit implementer is Haiti. But this is a very specific situation. Our main role is to strengthen national capacity. We are not there to do things on behalf of the country. We are there to improve their own capacity, to strengthen their national capacity, to strengthen their leadership in the health sector in the country in order to be able to advance the public health agenda.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So great The question of what gives you hope is the strength of PAHO makes the region a leader in global health. But given the complexity of the situation you have described, there is a transition to diseases that are more common for more developed economies, while we are still dealing with diseases of poorer countries. There's the whole fight against misinformation, disinformation in the area of health that we saw was so prevalent in the time of the COVID pandemic. Now there's the whole questioning of scientific fact and the importance of vaccination, for example. And I know you just started a vaccination campaign in the Americas and you just went to Canada. How do you see PAHO engaging with organizations outside the health sector to be able to attack all of these issues that are multivariant and from different angles? How can like the private sector, governments, universities like ours, how can we all collaborate to attack this complexity?
Now, this is really probably one of the most important challenges that we have nowadays. Of course, there is a direct impact on vaccination, but it's not the only affecting vaccination. We know nowadays thousands of doctors that on Instagram, on Facebook, they are advertising things that can boost your immune system, so you don't need to have antibiotics, or you not need to get a vaccine, or that this can replace your treatment for cancer, things like that. That is sometimes we think, how is it possible that people still believe in this kind of thing? But this is a reality that we have. I think that we need to adapt our strategy to the current scenario. The reality that the people, I don't know if this is for good or for the bad, but they don't trust the governments as they used to trust in the past. We have a surveys in the region showing that for the decision about the vaccination, for instance, the most trusted source to provide information to the families so they can make the decision is the healthcare workers. And I just wonder how many doctors, nurses, physicians, how many of them can really give the correct information to the family when they ask, why do I need to keep vaccination my child against polio if there is polio for decades? Do I really need to give 3 doses of this vaccine? Only 1 dose is enough. You are saying that I need to give 3 different vaccines to my baby today. This will not increase the risk of fever, of a side event. Do I really need to take 3 vaccines at the same time? Should it be better to have one by one? So when we look to the data, of course, misinformation is a huge threat. But let me give you an example that the misinformation has several dimensions. The coverage for measles immunization in the Americans, the first dose is 89%. It's very good. It's better than any other region in the world, but it's not enough because to protect against measles, you need to get at least 95%, and 95 not as an average, but 9% in every state, province, department, city, neighborhood, so homogeneously distributed. 89% the first dose. The second dose it decreases to 79. So these families, they didn't become anti-vax. For the other all vaccines, we have similar data. For DPT, that the child takes at 2 months, 4 months, and 6 months, the difference between the first dose to the third dose is 20-25 percentage points. So it's not that they are anti-vax because they went there and they got the vaccine, the first dose. What is missing that the way that we communicate in most countries, I think that is the same that we used to do 10, 20 years ago, and this is not enough. So I really believe that we need to rethink the way that we are communicating, and we need to mobilize healthcare workers, religious leaders. I think that the whole community, because vaccination is not the only individual protection, and you know that it also is an act of solidarity because it protects the entire society. I was in Canada. In Canada, most cases, or almost 100% of cases in Canada of measles are mild cases. And in general, for a middle-class family, measles is a mild disease. But in Mexico last year, only we had 9 deaths related to measles among indigenous population. So 9 children died of measles because for this specific population, measles is not a mild disease. So I think that we really need to think how we can communicate it better. Now we can respond every day to the rumors, fake news, all the things that are being delivered through social media to all the decks that you have. But at the same time, it's important that in some countries they need also to provide a better organization of the health service that they have. Because 51% of the poorest families in Latin America, they have only one adult that brings some income to the family. This adult is a woman. This woman is working in the informal economy. So they don't have a social protection network to support them. With all the new vaccines that you have incorporated, this woman needs to go 10 to 12 times to a health center in the first year of her baby. If everything goes well, if every time that she goes, the center is open, the vaccine is there, the healthcare work is there. So every time that this woman goes to a health center, she's probably that day she will have less money to purchase the food for their family. So if the health centers are open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, this is a barrier. The vaccines are there, are available, they are free of charge, but this is a real social barrier that is preventing this woman to get access to vaccines. So misinformation is a problem, but it's not the only problem. We really need to provide better use of the data so we can identify who are the unvaccinated in order to identify the barriers and to adapt and adopt strategies that can overcome these barriers.
Interesting that you're talking about data and tools to reach the people that are the hardest to reach. And I was thinking AI is transforming every sector in our society. And I was very interested to hear how Paz was thinking about that impact that AI might have on health system, both the opportunities it creates as well as what threats you are foreseeing that might come from artificial intelligence.
That's a very good question. We have been working for several years now in a partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. This alliance was aiming at the beginning to strengthen the quality of the information system for health. But 3 years ago, I signed another agreement with the president of IDB to build what we call the Pan America Digital Highway. And this is to aim to improve or to accelerate the digital health transformation, including the use of artificial intelligence in the health sector. So we are working with the countries from supporting them to assess their maturity level to use AI tools. So what they are missing in order of laws, regulation, frameworks to protect the privacy, to guarantee that this will be used in an ethical manner. But at the same time, we are already offering some concrete applications. I will give you an example. PAHO has a unique mechanism that is a pool procurement mechanism that purchases vaccines on behalf of the countries, but also medicines, medical devices, and other health technology. In Paraguay, we are using, not only Paraguay, but Paraguay was the first. The Ministry of Health, with our support, purchased mobile X-ray devices that can go to a prison, and prisons are a very important spot for TB in the world, but in Latin America it's particularly important. It's so important that you know that we measure the incidence of TB in general by 100,000 inhabitants. So the incidence is 10 by 100,000 or 20 by 100,000. In prisons in Latin America is a percentage. 50% of the prisoners have TB. 20% of prisoners have TB. So high is the burden of TB. And to mobilize 1,000 prisoners from the prison to a health center is a logistic nightmare that no Minister of Health will take this risk because it can cost his or her political career if there is something that happens. So with this mobile X-ray, it goes to the prison, can perform the screening, and AI runs the face screening. So you need only to mobilize 20, 30, 40 prisoners to go to a health center after the face screening. This is also now is being used to reach indigenous communities and people that live in remote areas that, again, you cannot bring them. So from the general supporting them to the general laws, regulations framework to guarantee that they will be using AI because it's a very important tool in an ethical manner to concrete application that this is now a very important part of our technical cooperation.
My last question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. We have students and young professionals here in the audience, and what would be your advice for those that are just beginning their careers in global health? AI is one component that it's changing the job market tremendously. But global health, if you want to collaborate in a multilateral organization, that's changing. So what are the skills that are needed, the career paths, and why did you decide to go into global health as well?
Well, this is I think that in my particular case, global health was kind of a natural development of my engagement in public health and from a managerial perspective. But I think that it's very important, if I can give you an advice, is that it's important of course, to manage well the foundations of public health. I think that the statistics, epidemiology, planning, everything that. But at the same time, nowadays, I think that to have also a very solid knowledge about the political science, diplomacy, I think that is really very important, and also to keep an open mind. I think that this is important because let me tell you that public health, all the progress that we have made in public health, sometimes they are based in concepts that are very rigid. So sometimes the success of a public health program is at the same time the curse at the end because it's a strategy that works well for 20, 30 years, but at the same point it is almost a flat line when you see a graph. Why? Because it was a very good strategy, and when the target is very wide, you can shot at any point of the target that you will reach it. The problem is the target starts shrinking. Because it is shrinking because some groups of the population are not being reached by the traditional strategy. So what's happening that you need to change? How you can adapt it, how you can identify what are the barriers. I think that this is one thing that keeping me awake during the night because sometimes we have the new strategy, but the public health program is so rigid that they take 2, 3, 4, 5 years to adapt it to incorporate new ways to deliver, and some groups are clearly not being able to be reached by this strategy. So, besides all the knowledge that you need now, political science, diplomacy, maybe anthropology, also it's very important to understand what are because it's not to translate a policy. You need to interact with people with different cultures, with different perspectives. So it's really important. But keep your mind open and think how can I do better? What's not working? Don't be so confident that we are also applying the most updated strategy based on the best science, and we don't need to be quick of that or thinking how we can improve it.
Well, as a former diplomat, I love that you plugged in the importance of diplomacy, and you're at Georgetown. So if you are doing public health, the best place because of the strength of the School of Foreign Service. So with that, I want to turn it over to the audience for questions. So just raise your hand and please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barbosa. My name is Maya Anand. I'm at the medical school currently. And my question was, you talked about how social media and like misinformation is a big problem. But we're also now seeing a lot of doctors and government organizations and other organizations making their own social media accounts and posting videos and posting infographics and kind of leaning into that field themselves. Do you, in your opinion, think that that's a smart choice for them to do, to like continue to involve in social media and kind of make it like communicate with people that way? Or do you think there are other better ways to improve their communication in that specific aspect?
No, I think that social media is a reality that we cannot ignore. So, in the past, and I am taking the example of the immunization. Very simple messages were enough because if people value the generation that saw the generation of their parents with polio cases, children that died or that had disabilities for the entire life, they value the vaccination. But now I think that what we recommend, and we have several technical guides and workshops that we offer to the Ministry of Health. They need to monitor social media because when something is starting, it's much better if you can provide another view and provide a reliable source talking about that matter, then wait until the end. I'll just give you an example. For vaccines, we have a very strong side events surveillance system. Everything that happens after a vaccine is applied in a person can be considered as a side event. So if a child gets a vaccine today and has something 3 days, 2 days, fever, goes to a hospital, pneumonia, whatever, this is investigated to see if there is any kind of link with the vaccine. And this is important because vaccines are very safe, but you are giving that vaccine to hundreds of thousands of people. One batch of vaccine has 200,000, 300,000 doses. So if there is something wrong, you can have thousands of people being affected. So it's very important to have this very sensitive surveillance system. But sometimes the Ministry of Health, something happens and they don't communicate well. So the media goes with one child had the vaccine and died 3 days after that. Sometimes there's nothing related to vaccine. But if the Ministry of Health doesn't go immediately to say, we are investigating, these are the findings that you have, and you wait until 1 month after, when a thorough investigation was made, the first impression that there was something wrong with that vaccine because one child died will be it's not the truth, but probably will be the perception of the society. So I think that's very important. Ministry of Health nowadays, they need to monitor social media. And the way they identify that there is a rumor, fake news about the vaccine, they need to mobilize physicians, nurses, scientists, the academic institution to come out and to share what's happening in a very transparent way.
Thank you.
Questions? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Rebecca and I'm a global health student. I'm from Brazil. And my question goes directly towards your work done in Brazil I've been reading a lot about the AI implementation in the Brazilian public health system, SUS. And my question was just more towards how do you think the system will take hold and do what it's supposed to do to improve the efficiency of the system, given Brazil's historical with like corruption, and do you think that will like close the gap for any inequities in Brazil as well?
Yes, I'm Brazilian too, but I here out of Brazil since 2018. But of course that we have a very, very strong technical cooperation with the Ministry of Health of Brazil. So I had the opportunity to, in a mission to Brazil, to review with the Ministry of Health what they are doing and what we are supporting them to do. Artificial intelligence, not only in Brazil, but in several other countries in the region, are already being used to support to improve the quality of care, because for something like an ECG or even for a lesion in on the skin, a problem or a X-ray, a chest X-ray, probably the artificial intelligence can learn and can run a screen much better than a doctor or one nurse. So I think that this is now the most important application that they are using AI. Now, of course, I think that we are at the first steps of it. We are also. I went to Spain a couple of months ago to sign an agreement with Spain in certain areas and to extend. We have a support from the Barcelona Foundation. Barcelona, the soccer team. I know that in the US, soccer is not very popular as it is in the rest of the world, but there is this famous soccer team in Spain called Barcelona. They have a foundation, and they are supporting a project that we have in Panama that is using drone to deliver medicines to a remote area in Panama, in one of the most dangerous area in Panama, the Darien Gap. There I could see, and we are trying to also to offer this to the country here, that they in a primary health care center, that they are changing the way that physicians are talking with patients, right? Because and this is not the only app. Probably you have several, and you are trying to make this an open source app so the countries can use it free of charge. But the physician is not behind the desk with the screen between the doctor and the patient. They are at the same level, and the AI is listening the conversation and is filling the electronic history of the patient. So the doctor doesn't need to share his attention with the patient and the computers. So things like that I think that we are clearly in a moment of revolution that will bring a lot of positive impact to improve the quality and to provide more access to people living in remote areas. Of course, using within a framework of ethical use, always having a human on the loop, as we say, that you cannot trust artificial intelligence to do anything alone and to give a diagnosis or provide a treatment for a person, of course, that this can be supervised. But it's a lot of things going on.
Sir, you had your hand up? Yeah.
I'm Pinaki Parigrahi. I'm from Department of Pediatrics at the medical school. I will go back to the first question on vaccines and myths and misinformation and all that. I mean, we as pediatricians know how difficult it is if, in terms of vaccines now, how difficult it's getting. And my question is, when if depending on how you really propagate the information, as you said, if there is one death and somebody says, "Oh, there is a death," and you're really scaring the public. On the other hand, if they come to us, we have to be transparent. We have to give them all statistics and everything, which doesn't really work as well. And then we have debated, should it be the other way around? We should also go head to head and say, show all the worst things, all negative campaign against non-vaccinated ones, have another group of people who are not transparent enough. They just do the opposite. Will it work? And if at all, who does that? I mean, as academicians or as institutions, we cannot. as FAHO or any international body, I don't think that will be appropriate to do that. So who is going to do it, if at all? First of all, should it be done to handle it? If so, who will do it? And then actually, my real question was, how are we really handling all even WHO sections? Like India has in India United Nations Fund, something separate. Of course, the world is big, and there are regional centers, WHO regional offices. How do you really? There has to be some kind of a body, like whether you call it UN or WHO. How is it working out? How do you work with other WHO agencies, and is it a happy thing, or because how are you handling it now? I mean, even keeping aside what our boss is doing, that will pass. I mean, that's not going to last forever. We have 2.5 years in general.
I think that one good point and one good question. Let me tell you, I'm always in favor that you need to be transparent. Because if you are not transparent, I think that the fashion will be more important than the truth. And we have several examples in the region. And unfortunately, I was, before joining PAHO, I was Vice Minister of Health Surveillance in Brazil. I was the head of the National Health Regulatory Authority there. So you could imagine how many public health crises I was managing, like from dengue outbreaks to, I don't know, a problem with a vaccine that the people were thinking that maybe it could have caused a severe problem, etc. So I think that's really important to be transparent with the information, because there are some estimations that the 1.5% of the population is anti-vax. And they, regardless what you say, they will not take vaccine. But if it's only 1.5%, this will not jeopardize the society, because the community protection will protect them too, even if they don't get vaccinated. The problem is how we can get access to the 15 to 20% that sometimes they are called vaccine hesitants. They are not anti-vax, but they want to get more information. They want to get information about what they need. They need to get vaccination to their children. They want information about how we can ensure that the vaccine is safe and is efficacious and is efficient. So I think that this is the information that probably in nursery and medical schools we need to have more information to the students, because I don't know in medicine school how many hours of vaccines we have. I remember during the pediatric 6 months, maybe 1 week about that. But I never, during my course, I never was clearly informed about what's the process to ensure that a vaccine is safety, what all the regulatory steps, all the clinical trial process before that. So I think that if we are not giving this information to healthcare workers, they will not be able to translate them to. And you have several examples in the region. In Colombia, as you know, HPV vaccine, and it's important because sometimes people say that the first information about a vaccine is not written by the scientists, it's by the lawyers. So the lawyers try to protect the vaccine. If the clinical trial was maybe with 3 doses, they will say that you need to get 3 doses of this vaccine to be protected. 1 year after that, there are some new information showing that only 2 doses are enough. With HPV now, only 1 dose, we have tons of evidence to say that only one dose is enough to protect girls and boys that take the vaccine. But and we recommend that the countries to adopt different strategies, not to wait the adolescents to come to a health center, because they don't go to health center, but to vaccinate them in school. But some countries, Colombia, Brazil, we had a similar case. When I was in the Ministry of Health, we handled a similar case, but I think that we handled better. But in Colombia and in other countries, they went to a school, they put this long line of adolescents, and when one adolescent fainted, others, 3, 4, 7, and this was a problem because we had the people saying that there was some neurological disorder produced by the vaccine.
Yeah.
In Colombia, it was so badly managed that I went in Colombia last year. And I asked our representative there because I was going to meet with the Ministry of Health and I was going to the data and the coverage of HPV was below 50. The face dose, so only one face dose. Why? And she told me, because when there was this problem 5 years ago, they suspended the vaccination in schools. When they correct what we made after the first case, that it was not in one count, but in several, was to not putting them in a long line under the sun at the 30 degrees Celsius, or to have them standing, but to sit them to give the vaccine. So with some relatively simple procedures, you could prevent this kind of thing. So I think that being transparent is the best way, but we cannot let anything without a good answer to the population and to the families. I think that you asked in a very diplomatic way how we can handle the situation because the US is not a part of WHO. I don't know if it was the consequence that these are challenging times, because the US and Argentina, we have 2 countries in the region that are not members of WHO, but they are members of PAHO. Because they recognize that you have this individual constitution. But at the same time, of course, the US is reviewing all the participation in international organizations, the financial commitment that they make to these organizations. So we are at the same time in conversation with the US. We have made several movements in the organization before to be more transparent, more efficient, more accountable, to give to all member states reassurance about it, that every cent that they pay to the organization is used in the best way, following the best international standards. But at the same time, we implemented several cost-saving measures, protecting our capacity to provide technical cooperation to the countries, and also bringing new donors and new partners to the organization. So I was in Canada until this morning. Canada now is the largest contributor to PAHO through voluntary contribution, because the US, that used to be the most important, terminated the USAID. So for several programs, we need to reduce these programs. We needed to look for other partners. The malaria elimination program, that was almost 100% funded by the USAID. We need to, unfortunately, to put a pause on the program. But now with a new partner, that's the Gates Foundation, we are working. Because we are the region that we have 20 countries that we have eliminated malaria. Suriname last year became the first country in the Amazon basin that was certified as having eliminated malaria. So we cannot stop the progress and the technical cooperation that we are providing to the country. So including this India funds for, I think that UN India Fund for Development is supporting some projects that we have. I visited the one in Paraguay 2 years ago, in a very poor region in Paraguay called Chaco. That's a region that is shared by Paraguay, Argentina. And we also presented some projects for Caribbean countries that India has more close to them. But Japan, now a couple of weeks ago, made a donation for humanitarian support in Venezuela. Korea is supporting some programs in countries in Latin America. So we are looking to Spain increasing a lot their support to PAHO, the European Union. So, of course, the US is the most important financial contributor to PAHO in a certain contribution, the quota that every country has to pay. But we are trying to be at the same time saving, cost-saving measures, being implemented in order to guarantee that we will keep our capacity to continue providing technical cooperation to the country. And we work very well together with all the other UN agencies.
I remember perfectly the incident you were describing with the vaccines in Colombia. I'm Colombian. And it
You were
was,
there.
no, they were talked that it was mass hysteria with all the girls when they were receiving the vaccines. It was incredible, and the amount of
We had a similar in Brazil. I was the vice minister for health surveillance, so I was with the minister and the president launching the program 1 week after the minister called me. There was a problem in São Paulo.
yeah.
4 adolescents fainted, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And then we went to review the literature. There was one case in Australia. Australia was the first country to implement HPV vaccine. The first year that they implement, they have a similar. There is a denomination for that. I don't know that it's
We
a
have,
little bit, there's a little bit of prejudice, but
we have time for one more question. I saw you raise your hand, so
Yeah,
let's
thank you. Hi, I'm Emily Mendenhall. I'm an anthropologist professor in the School of Foreign Service. One of the things that I think is really important, especially as the US slips in our health outcomes and our leadership, is learning from other places. And PAHO has long been a leader in global health. And throughout Latin America, there are so many exemplar countries that we have a lot to learn from. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the lessons learned and exemplars from Latin America that the US could really learn from, and what are 1 or 2 specific things that could be transformed in the US healthcare system and public health landscape by learning from Latin America.
that's a very good question. And I think that the Minister of Health of Canada asked me the same question on Monday. Because in Canada, the system is very decentralized, as it is in Brazil or in Argentina. In Mexico, it was, but now it's more centralized. But the indigenous population health is the Minister of Health, the federal Minister of Health is responsible. So she wanted us to share some innovative ways to work with indigenous communities that we have learned in the region. I think that, of course, the US is a very complex country because at the same time, the US has some of the strongest public health agencies in the world. The US CDC is a very important partner to us. They have several reference laboratories for the region, for polio, for flu, for measles, for several diseases. They have reference laboratories. They provide training. The US CDC is still a collaborator of PAHO. The USAID was terminated, but the voluntary contributions that we received from the US CDC, they are keeping them. But the CDC also has probably the strongest national health regulatory authority, the FDA, the NIH, that is one of the most important centers for research and development of health technology. But at the same time, it's a country with some complex situations because at the same time that is the country that has the largest expenditure for the health sector, both for private and public. The public expenditure is very high, but when you see the health outcomes, the US is behind several countries in Europe and in Asia that are spending less money. So something is telling us that probably changing the way that the system, of course, this is a sovereign decision of the country. We cannot make a prescription, but sometimes I think that what we are now implementing in the region, one of our main priorities that we have is to strengthen primary health care. In thinking of primary health care now, a new primary health care, not the primary health care that is in the Alma Ata Declaration. Alma Ata Declaration was a revolution at that time, but it's a document that has almost 50 years. It's almost 50 years old now. Because when you read the Alma Ata Declaration, it only mentions child and maternal health, and mention some endemic diseases, and that's it. Because this was the epidemiological scenario at that time. Now, if the primary health care is not able to solve the problem, is not able to offer a better diagnosis and treatment for hypertension, for diabetes, and if primary health care, mental health, and if the primary health care is not the best way to get access to specialized care when you need one, the people will prefer to go to emergency room because they wait there 4 hours, 6 hours, but they will have the X-ray, the lab tests, and everything. So we launched the alliance with the IDB and the World Bank that now 10 countries have already formally joined. So they are using loans that they have, or they were negotiating with these banks to strengthen primary health care. Thinking about renovating health centers, training for healthcare workers, equipment, like point of care diagnosis equipment, connectivity, telehealth, telemedicine. So we will have this primary health care in their capacity to solve the problems of the population, they're closer to the population. Because I think that in no country, even the richest country in the world, and the US, can afford to treat a diabetic person or a person with hypertension in a specialized care. This is completely not feasible, let's say so. Now, when we have a population that is growing old with the demographic transition, we have at the same time new technologies. The US, just to give you an example, that the US could learn from the UK, but also several countries in Latin America. The US is the only developed country that I know that has no health technology assessment to incorporate new technologies in the system. In the UK, for instance, or in Brazil, the National Health Regulatory Authority, that is the FDA here, first assess the clinical trials, the dossier, the good manufacturing practice, everything, and says, okay, you can use this medicine. So it's allowed to be used. Here in the US, the other day, the health insurance, the private health insurance need to offer that medicine to their clients, consumers, patients. In the UK and in Brazil, there is another step. And the health system has an assessment to say, okay, based on methodologies that are used, are similar in every country that perform this kind of assessment, the ceiling price for this medicine here is this one, and the protocol to be used is this one. So in the US, you don't have this. So this could be clearly a thing that maybe provide better. There was something similar to that in the US. That was a negotiation between the federal government to provide the medicines to the veterans subsystem, Medicare, Medicaid. But this was abolished during the Bush administration because at that time an expensive medicine was a medicine that cost, I don't know, 1,000. Now we have genetic therapy that goes over $1 million. So I think that this just an example, or two examples. I think primary health care, I think that could be maybe, there are several states and countries here that have very good experiences also to share. But maybe we think about this North-South cooperation that will encourage not like transferring knowledge from the North to the South, but sometimes I think that's better to think about sharing information, sharing experience, adapting the experience to your context.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barbosa, for this conversation. We now have closing remarks from the list.
Well, thank you very much for the co-organizers of this event, the Global Health Institute, the Americas Institute, also the School of Foreign Services, Science, Technology, and International Affairs program. It really has been a privilege to co-organize this event with you. And thank you, of course, first and foremost, Dr. Barbosa, for such an enlightening conversation. I have had the privilege of working at the O'Neill Institute for many years now, and we have been a collaborating center of PAHO for also over, I think, a decade at this point. So I've really been fortunate to witness, our collaboration and the power of PAHO across the Americas on different fronts in different areas. And one thing that I did want to highlight is how PAHO has displayed remarkable leadership across many areas, but I wanted to give one concrete example that I think relates to the final stretch of this conversation, which has been the leadership in preventing non-communicable diseases with a number of public policies. At the O'Neill Institute, we partner many times with governments and with civil society. And one of the issues that we have been working closely with them on is food policy and thinking about how to improve diets in different populations. And what we consistently hear, for example, is the role that PAHO has played with the nutrient profile model and how this has been such an important tool to engage with governments, with regulatory agencies, to reform policies. And it is really one area where there has been remarkable leadership also at the global stage, right? And many of the solutions that we have seen come out of the Americas are now being studied or being replicated in different countries across the world. And I think a lot of this is due to PAHO's efforts also in improving capacity across countries, in fostering dialogue and making sure that lessons learned are exchanged. And it's really one example among many, among private primary healthcare and different points that came across in this conversation, where we do see a lot of this leadership bear fruits in very concrete ways. So across this conversation, Dr. Barbosa, you mentioned different challenges that we have experienced in the region. You mentioned inequities across countries, but also inequities within countries and what that looks like in practice. What are some of the challenges that are associated with that? The issue of communication, miscommunication, and how this has shifted across generations, and how it really calls upon us to reimagine the way that we are engaging in public health communication, how we are engaging with AI in this present scenario. And all of these conversations, I think, will continue evolving. And as we move forward in them, I think it's increasingly important to have convening spaces where we can have honest conversations, where we can bring together different institutions, learn from the experience and the expertise of leaders like Dr. Barbosa. And in this sense, it really has been a privilege for us to come together and offer this space. But I did want to say, I think, on the behalf of all of the organizers, that please do count on us and on Georgetown University to keep fostering exchanges and spaces, and count on us as a resource in whichever way we can be helpful. And really looking forward not only to seeing how we can overcome some of these challenges, but also think about all of the creativity, all of the innovation that we see come out of the Americas, really at the global stage, taking leadership in tackling many of the problems that we're seeing. So for sure, challenging, trying times, but also I think a lot in terms of reimagining and thinking creatively about how to build and how to tackle many of these challenges that we have been discussing. And thank you all for coming and for the great questions as well. Thank you.